Somewhere beneath the war-scarred sands of central Yemen sits a temple with 8 limestone pillars. It was buried for over 1,000 years. The American oil man who found it had to flee it under gunfire before he could finish digging. Locals still don't call it by its real name. They call it the Sanctuary of Bilqis, the throne of the Queen. A queen who appears in the Bible, in Ethiopia's royal chronicles, and in the Qur'an, where her kingdom is destroyed by a flood that tore through a dam so massive it irrigated an area the size of a small country. For over 1,000 years, that flood was treated by many Western historians as legend, the kind of moralizing story religions invent to explain the fall of great empires. Then archaeologists found the dam, and it had, in fact, broken. So here's the question this documentary sits with. What happens when you take an ancient story seriously enough to go looking for the physical evidence, and the evidence starts looking back? The text that names her is the 27th chapter of the Qur'an, Surah An-Naml. In it, the prophet king Sulayman, known in the Bible as Solomon, sends a hoopoe bird to scout distant lands. The bird returns with an urgent report: a prosperous kingdom, ruled by a woman, with a throne so magnificent it becomes a plot point of its own, and a people who worship the sun instead of God. Sulayman writes to her. She could ignore the letter. She could go to war. Instead, she does something far more interesting. She consults her advisors, weighs her options, and decides the safest move is to go see him herself. But before she even arrives, the story takes a strange turn. According to the account, Sulayman asks his court which of them can bring her throne to him before she completes her journey. One figure present, described in the text as someone with knowledge of the scripture, says he can do it faster than the blink of an eye. And when Sulayman looks again, the throne is simply there, already in front of him, transported across hundreds of miles in an instant. It's one of the more genuinely strange, almost science fiction beats in the entire Qur'an, and later Islamic commentators spent centuries debating exactly who that figure was and how the feat was meant to be understood, whether literally, symbolically, or somewhere in between. Then the queen arrives. She's led toward what looks like a pool of water. She instinctively lifts her garments to keep them dry. It isn't water at all. It's a floor of polished glass, an illusion built specifically to test her perception. In the instant she realizes she misjudged what was right in front of her, she submits to belief in one God. The Quran never actually names her. That name, Bilqis, comes later, through Islamic scholarship, hadith literature, and popular tradition. Early commentators like Al-Tabari added their own texture to the story over the following centuries, describing her sending disguised servants ahead with gifts to test whether Sulayman was a true prophet or merely a powerful king. A detail found nowhere in the Quran itself, but repeated so often in later tradition that most versions of this story now include it. And this is exactly where the story stops being purely religious and starts being something you can dig for. Because a kingdom ruled by a queen, wealthy enough to build a legendary throne, far enough away to require a real journey, is either total invention, or it's describing something that actually existed. There's a kingdom in the archaeological record that fits the profile almost too well. It's called Saba. You know it better as Sheba. Saba was real, extensively documented, centered in what's now Yemen, around a city called Marib, with a second major center at Saba, roughly 40 kilometers to the west, which appears to have served for a time as an earlier political and religious capital before Marib eclipsed it. Historians place the emergence of Sabaean civilization somewhere between 1200 and 800 BCE, though the earliest phase is still debated. What isn't debated is what the Sabaeans built there, one of the wealthiest trading civilizations of the ancient world, controlling the export of frankincense and myrrh, resins so valuable they were burned in Egyptian temples and packed into mummies, carried north along the incense route by camel caravan, through hundreds of miles of desert, past fortified way stations, all the way to Gaza on the Mediterranean coast, where the goods were taxed, resold, and shipped onward into the Roman world. Some ancient writers described these caravans stretching for miles, though exact scale is impossible to verify. They left behind thousands of stone inscriptions, royal decrees, trade records, king lists, some naming a title, Mukarib, roughly meaning unifier or federator, used by early rulers before the title later shifted to king. This wasn't folklore with a location attached. This was a civilization that wrote everything down. And at its center sat something almost impossible to explain for a region this dry. Southern Arabia barely gets rain, and when it does, it arrives in short, violent bursts instead of steady seasons. Most ancient civilizations in that kind of climate either hugged a permanent river, the way Egypt clung to the Nile, or stayed small. The Sabaeans did neither. They dammed a seasonal riverbed, the Wadi Adana, with earthen walls historians describe as stretching roughly 650 meters across and rising some 15 meters high, reinforced with cut stone sluices on either end. They built a network of canals and sluice gates that caught the floodwater before it could waste itself in the sand. The result? Somewhere around 9,000 to 10,000 hectares of desert turned into farmland, the largest artificial oasis the ancient world had ever seen. The Roman geographer, Strabo, described the result as one of the most fertile regions in Arabia. Inscriptions found on site record repeated engineering upgrades stretching across centuries. This wasn't a mud wall. It was one of the great civil engineering projects of the ancient world. And it's the same dam that shows up, almost by name, in the Qur'an. Chapter 34, Surah Saba, named directly after this kingdom, describes a people living in prosperity, blessed with 2 great gardens, sustained by abundant provision, and told to be grateful for it. They weren't. In response, the text says, a catastrophic flood was sent against them, a flood it names specifically, Sel al-Arim, the flood of the dam. Their gardens were replaced with bitter fruit and thorny scrub. The community scattered. Here's where this stops being parable and starts being testable. The Marib Dam did, in historical fact, catastrophically fail. Not once. Inscriptions describe a major breach around 145 BCE, during conflict with a rival group called the Radanites, still echoed in old Arab proverbs about the tribes of Saba scattering. Whether that specific breach is the one the Quran is describing is still debated, because the dam kept failing and kept getting rebuilt. Documented repairs in 449, 450, 542, and 548 CE, with the last known repair dated to 557. Then, sometime in the second half of the 6th century, it went down for good. Ask 3 historians for the exact year, and you'll get 3 different answers, somewhere between the 540s and 570 CE. Nobody was keeping a standardized calendar for a desert dam. What nobody disputes is what happened next. The farmland collapsed. Trade routes shifted. Entire populations scattered across the Arabian Peninsula in migrations significant enough that Arab historians, writing centuries later, still used "scattered like the people of Saba" as a proverb. one that survived into the era just before Islam, and would still have carried real weight for the very first audience of the Qur'an. A German archaeologist, Werner Keller, examined this exact case decades ago and pointed to it as a rare instance where a religious account of a specific disaster matched the excavated, inscribed, dated record. Not every historian frames it in those exact terms. What they don't dispute is the shape of the story. A spectacular civilization, an engineering marvel, and a collapse precise enough to leave fingerprints in stone. So the flood checks out. The dam checks out. The kingdom checks out. Now for the harder part. Her. If Bilqis was real, you'd want two things. Proof that Saba could be ruled by a woman at all, and some direct trace of her. A name, a title, an inscription. The first one holds up better than you'd expect. The second is where this gets genuinely complicated. Start with plausibility. For a long time, Western historians treated the idea of a female Arabian monarch as more myth than history. Then Assyrian imperial records got in the way of that assumption. Starting in the 8th century BCE, the annals of Assyrian kings, Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, Ashurbanipal, repeatedly record battles with, and tribute from, women holding the formal title Queen of the Arabs. At least 5 of them, across roughly a century, with names preserved in cuneiform: Zabibe, Samsi, Tielhunu, Tabua, Adie. Different women, different reigns, the same striking pattern. Independent female sovereigns, ruling in their own right, not as anyone's consort. One of them, a queen named Samsi, led her own army into battle against Tiglath-Pileser III around 733 BCE. She lost. Her camp was burned. Her forces were routed. 9,400 soldiers gone, according to the Assyrian record.
Sit with that for a second. An Arabian queen commanding an army large enough to lose 9,400 men in a single defeat, recorded not by her own side, but by the empire that beat her. Archaeologists studying these records note something else revealing. The Assyrians reserved this specific royal title, Sharatu, almost exclusively for goddesses, and for these Arab queens. They never used it for their own royal women. Whoever these women were, Assyria understood them to hold real, independent, sovereign power. None of this proves Bilqis existed. These particular queens ruled tribal confederations further north, not confirmed Sabaeans specifically. But it kills the idea that a ruling queen in ancient Arabia was pure legend. It was a documented, repeated, political reality. Here's the genuinely honest complication, though. The Bible and the Qur'an place this queen in the era of Solomon, roughly the 10th century BCE. That's 2 to 3 centuries before those Assyrian queens. It's also earlier than most of the surviving Sabaean written record, which only becomes substantial starting in the 8th century BCE. Translation: the exact window when Bilqis is said to have ruled sits right before the depth of evidence we currently have from Saba itself. No inscription from that era anywhere names a Sabaean queen, and more broadly, the royal inscriptions Saba did leave behind are overwhelmingly about male rulers, which has left researchers openly split. Were royal women simply left out of a male-run record-keeping tradition, or did the legend shift some details along the way? This is one of the most actively argued questions in the field right now. Nobody's pretending it's settled. So, archaeology hasn't handed over her name. What it has handed over is stranger, and, in a way, more compelling. 7 kilometers southeast of ancient Marib, sits the largest known temple complex on the entire Arabian Peninsula. Inscriptions confirm its real name: the Temple of Awam, built for Al-Makka, the Sabaean moon god. Nearly 1,000 inscriptions have been recovered from its walls, the single largest collection of pre-Islamic Arabian writing ever found at one site. Most of them dedications, prayers for royal protection, records of pilgrimages made to honor Al-Makka by name. Construction dates back to at least the 7th century BCE. It stayed in active religious use for roughly 1,000 years. But nobody in Yemen calls it the Temple of Awam. They call it Marib Bilqis, the sanctuary of Bilqis. That's the temple from the opening of this documentary, the one with the 8 pillars still standing, still carrying her name, even though not one of those 1,000 inscriptions ever mentions her at all. The excavation story is its own kind of drama. In the spring of 1951, American archaeologist and oil executive Wendell Phillips led an expedition into Marib. He later wrote that his team was standing somewhere no American or European had documented in over 60 years. They uncovered a pillared hall, bronze and alabaster sculptures, staircases, inscriptions buried under 1,000 years of drifting sand. Then, in 1952, tribal violence forced them out. They left equipment behind and fled. The site sat almost untouched for nearly 50 years, until Phillips's sister, Marilyn Phillips Hodgson, picked up where he'd been forced to stop, leading 9 excavation seasons beginning in the late 1990s that confirmed just how massive the complex actually was. 600 meters west sits a second temple, the Baron Temple, which locals call Arsh Bilqis, the throne of Bilqis. Excavations there uncovered statues of women, unnamed, undated with certainty, but enough to keep the association alive. Nobody's found the inscription that says, in her own words, "I was here." What they've found is a landscape that has refused to let her go for over 2,000 years. There's a newer thread worth pulling, because this case is still actively developing. In 2023, researchers announced the decipherment of a Sabaean inscription on a jar excavated at the Ophel site in Jerusalem, dated to around the 10th century BCE, the exact era of Solomon. The inscription doesn't mention a queen, but it proves something researchers didn't have hard evidence for before. Sabaean goods and Sabaean people were physically reaching Jerusalem's trade networks in precisely the window this story requires. It's not proof she made the trip. It's proof the road existed and people were using it. Now, the part most retellings skip entirely, because it complicates the tidy version of the story.
Ethiopia has its own claim to this queen, one that predates most Western interest in Yemen by centuries. In the Ethiopian royal chronicle, known as the Kebra Nagast, compiled around the 14th century CE from oral traditions believed to be far older, she's named Makeda. Her kingdom sits in the Ethiopian highlands, and her union with Solomon becomes the founding legend of Ethiopia's Solomonic dynasty. A line of succession Ethiopian tradition traces forward for close to 3,000 years, right up to the 20th century reign of Haile Selassie. The same chronicle goes further, claiming their son, Menelik, later traveled to Jerusalem and returned to Ethiopia carrying the Ark of the Covenant itself, a claim treated as sacred history within the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, and to this day, unverifiable by any outside archaeologist, since the object said to be the Ark remains, by long-standing custom, sealed inside a chapel in Axum that no one but a single appointed guardian monk is permitted to see. In 2012, British archaeologist Louise Schofield led an expedition into Ethiopia's northern highlands and found something real. An ancient gold mining operation on the Geralta Plateau. Terracing and tools, she proposed, could date to around the 10th century BCE. A possible source for the legendary wealth described in the biblical account. On the other side of the Red Sea. So which one is correct? Yemen or Ethiopia? Here's the uncomfortable, honest answer. Historians don't fully know, and the two claims might not even be rivals. Sabaean influence, at various points, crossed the Red Sea into what's now Eritrea and Ethiopia. Shared temple architecture, shared inscriptions, shared religious symbols found at sites like Yeha in the Ethiopian highlands, where a Sabaean-style temple still stands, built using the same construction techniques found at Marib. It's entirely possible one trading empire straddling both coasts produced a queen that Yemen remembers through her temples and Ethiopia remembers through her dynasty. Not two competing legends. Maybe one queen, two surviving halves of the same memory. And here's where the story turns dark. Because this isn't just ancient history. It's happening right now. Yemen has been at war since 2015. Marib, the ancient capital of this entire story, now sits on the actual front line, fought over by Houthi rebels and an internationally backed government. In January 2023, UNESCO added the landmarks of the ancient kingdom of Saba, the Awam Temple, the Great Dam, 7 sites in total, to its World Heritage List. In the same breath, it added them to a second list, World Heritage in Danger. In May 2015, a coalition airstrike partially destroyed one of the main sluice gates of the Great Dam of Marib. The structure this entire story revolves around. A piece of engineering that survived 2,500 years of desert wind, damaged in a modern war in a matter of seconds. Looting has followed, not driven by greed, but by desperation. Displaced families selling antiquities just to eat. Museum staff who remain in the country have shifted much of their effort toward documentation, photographing and cataloguing collections, so that, if the worst happens, at least a record survives, even if the object doesn't. Archaeologists still working in Yemen have largely shifted from discovery to triage, recording what remains before it's shelled, or simply lost to neglect nobody currently has the resources to prevent. Even under those conditions, the search hasn't fully stopped. It's just changed shape. Where Wendell Phillips once needed a shovel and enough luck to outrun armed tribesmen, today's researchers increasingly work from a distance. Satellite mapping projects like the ancient Yemen Digital Atlas, tracing Sabaean settlements and irrigation systems without needing boots on dangerous ground. Isotope analysis on artifacts recovered before the war continues in labs far from Marib, tracing ancient trade routes long after the dig sites themselves became too dangerous to reach. Researchers in the field are candid about what this means. Yemen's archaeological potential remains, in their words, still largely untapped. What's been found so far may be a fraction of what's actually there, waiting behind a war that shows no sign of ending. So, back to the question this documentary opened with. The kingdom is real, not a metaphor, not a moral fable. An extensively excavated, thoroughly inscribed civilization sitting exactly where tradition says it should. The irrigation described in the Qur'an isn't exaggeration. It's a fairly restrained description.
And the idea of a woman ruling an entire Arabian kingdom independently, commanding armies, controlling trade, isn't legend layered onto history after the fact. Assyrian records confirm women held exactly that kind of power in this exact region. What's missing is the one thing that would end the debate for good. Her name,
carved in stone, in her own era. It hasn't surfaced. Maybe it's still buried somewhere under Marib's sand, waiting for a war to end before anyone can safely look for it. Maybe it never existed the way we'd want it to, and the truth is quieter and stranger than a single inscription could capture. But go back to that temple. 8 pillars, buried for over 1,000 years, found by a man who had to flee it under gunfire before he'd even finished digging. Nobody who lives near it calls it the Temple of Awam. They call it hers. They've been calling it hers for longer than anyone has been able to prove why. Maybe that's the real discovery here. Not a name in stone. A civilization that kept remembering her anyway, for 3,000 years, without needing the proof at all. If this journey through the sands of Marib left you with more questions than answers, that's not a failure of the story. That's what real history actually looks like. If you found it compelling, let me know in the comments where you think the truth lies, Yemen or Ethiopia. And subscribe for more evidence-based documentaries uncovering the history behind the world's most enduring stories.